Thank you for the opportunity to give a presentation. My name is Erik Skibsted, and I have been working with PAT for many years at Novo Nordisk, and also did a PhD in process analytical technology from the University of Amsterdam. And over some years, I also worked with a little bit other things, but now we're back working 100% on PAT solutions at Novo Nordisk. Both for oral solid dosage forms, but now we also have started to work more intensely for liquid formulations, injectable medicine. And the work I will present to you is part of our strategy for the oral space, that we need to be able to answer all the questions the FDA and EMA will have to us, because some of our PAT applications are used for GMP production also. So why does effective sample size matters? We develop models to predict it. The reason is, as FDA explicit writes in the guideline from 21, that they need to understand an estimation and a rationale for what we claim to be the effective sample size, but also be able to explain what happens when the sample is moving, which we'll do in all our inline applications. And there are a couple of questions you need to be able to answer. So how much material contributes to your spectrum? And whether as the sample is moving during the spectral acquisition. For many of us, we all have instruments where we set a number of subscans like the central probe, and then average that to a final spectrum. So we need to understand if the individual subscans are truly independent or if there's an overlap. And then some estimation about the spectrum, is it representative of the process? So it's more like an explanation, where do you choose to do your sampling in your manufacturing process? EMA has a very short sentence, just an estimation. But we developed mathematical models, so mechanistic models, to answer all these questions for different variety of sampling accessories. But we can also use these models to select like the acquisition parameters, and also work with proactively to reduce the spectral variance, or when we understand what parameters affect the effective sample size. So both some regulatory needs for this, but also some development needs when we develop our PAT applications. So I've developed models for 5 sampling setups. You recognize some of them. I choose to show a probe here for a static sample measurement. We use the same models for this when we measure on powder samples in vials on our QC NIR instruments. So a static sample measurement, we started with the Tazo spoon, and now we have worked with the spider wheel. We also have some internal designs. I call them Novo Design Roman number 1 and 2. They work in different ways compared to the other sampling setups. This one has what we call low restriction flow, and the other one has what we call condensed phase moving powder. But today I want to speak about the model we developed to calculate the sampling effective sample size for a spider wheel. So one of the reasons it's relevant to understand is that if the sampling is primarily determining the variance of your results, then increasing the effective sample size would lower your analytical variance. So this is the very simplistic way of looking on that relationship. So what we can expect is that when we double the effective sample size, the variance will go down by a factor of 2 and the standard deviation by a factor of square root 2. So very simply, if we have a sample device where we have 50 milligrams as an effective sample size and RMSEP of 1 milligram per gram, if we can choose another sample device where we double the effective sample size, our RMSEP will drop by 1 over square root of 2. So this is one way of looking on how you use the effective sample size to work with your PAT process variability. So what we expect is that when we increase the RPM, we will have a higher effective sample size and then lower spectral variance and more stable API predictions. And Andreas will come back to the real results. So we start very simplistic. We say that the NIR probe, or it could also be a Raman probe, has an optical interaction volume. Very simplistic. I know there are papers talking about how it's more spherical and things like that, but for this engineering exercise, it works really good. So we have the diameter of the probe and the light penetration depth, and there are numerous ways to try to estimate that, and we have one way to do that for a statical optical mass, which we use. And then very simply, we take the volume of the sample, of this illuminated interaction volume, as we call it, and we multiply with the bulk density, and then we have a mass of this sample for one given optical interaction volume. When it comes to dynamic systems, we then talk about renewal or refreshment. So imagine we move this sample across the probe. Over the time of the acquisition, we will have several renewal events during this acquisition, and I draw them as 4 circles next to each other. But there's a penalty with the spider wheel, and that are the fingers. When the fingers are blocking in front of the probe, we have to correct for that, and we call that the spider wheel specific correction. So we need to understand during an acquisition how much of the time is the window blocked by a finger. And that is what I will go to in the next slide. So here you see a 3D drawing of a simplistic drawing of the spider wheel. So the geometric setup we need to understand is, of course, the spot radius, and in a central probe system it's 5 millimeters I've taken here. Then we took some numbers as what is the finger width at the point where it crossed the sensor probe, and I say 3 millimeters. You probably maybe have a more precise number, but you understand what I allude to here. And then we need to understand the probe radial position from the center of the spider wheel, from the center here to the center of the probe, and that I set to 18 millimeters. So the powder falls into the wheel and get transported across the probe window, and the fingers, they caught what we call a periodic binary blocking intervals, and that at those blocking intervals we do not see any powder. And what determines the effective sample size is also what is the speed across the probe position at this position here, because that determines how much new fresh material is presented to the probe. So a few equations, very easily. First, faster renewal gives more material. So the angular velocity, so it's simply 2 pi multiplied with the rotation per minute divided by 60. Then you have the angular velocity in radius per second. Then you multiply that with the distance from the center to the probe center. Then you have the velocity across the probe face. And the diameter of the probe divided by that speed is the time it takes to cross the probe. So that's the T crossing. And now to the penalty effect. The first thing you need to accept is that I make it very simplistic. I say the angular interval where we have blocking is the sum of the angular width of the finger at the position and the angular width of the probe. When we add them, that means as soon as the finger starts to touch the edge of the spot, we say it's blocked. It's of course not completely true, but you could work with this and make it more like integral or something like that over with the speed. But for simplistic reasons, I just simply say the total overlap is the angular width of the finger plus the angular width of the probe. So the blocking takes, we call that a single blocking event. The time it takes where we have blocking would be that interval divided by with the angular velocity. And then we have a spider wheel with 4 fingers. You could probably have one with 3 or 5. We discussed different designs many years ago with Expo. So you can calculate the number of finger passing events during one spectral acquisition. And that is the time it takes to acquire a spectrum, multiplied with the rotational speed, multiplied with the number of fingers, divided by 60. And now you have the numbers to calculate the time during an acquisition where the spectrum is blocked, or the probe is blocked. So it's the number of passes multiplied with the time it takes to the probe is blocked. And then finally we can derive what is we call the effective powder viewing time. So it's the total acquisition time minus the time it's blocked simply, and then I put in some maximum in order for if you have some extreme blocking situations. So this is the effective time we have powder in front of the probe during the spectral acquisition. And now we have all the components we need. We can calculate how many refreshed sum samples we have by taking the effective time divided by the time it takes to cross, so the number of adjacent circles, as you can say. And then we multiply that with the naive way of calculating the effective sample size for one of these circles, one of these cylinders. So in basic, for the spider wheel architecture, we need these 3 components, simply the probe geometry, penetration depth, and bulk density. It will give us the mass effective sample for one refresh. We need some of the geometry here, also and the speed of the RPM, the probe position. It determines the crossing time across the probe. And then some geometry numbers here, the width of the finger, for example, and the RPM again will tell us what is the block time. So what is our effective time? It should be TEFF here. As an example here, one thing we tested in our pilot plan was 32 RPM. And if you assume a penetration depth of 1 millimeter, it's something numbers we know. We have tested on a static sample. We have derived to around 1 millimeter for light penetration depth and a bulk density of 0.4 for a blend material, and acquisition time almost 2 seconds. This will give us a crossing time, a block time of 0.52 seconds of the total 1.8 seconds. So the effective acquisition time would be 1.28, and then the estimated refresh count would be 15.7 renewal events. If we multiply that with 8 milligram, we end up in an effective sample size estimate around 126 milligrams. So these are the calculations you have to go through. Calculate the optical mass per refresh. How much blockage time do you have and your total time. Then you have your renewal counts, and you can estimate your effective sample size. So here you see, and that's the interesting part. If you work with different RPMs and also different spider wheel geometries, these patterns would look a little bit different. So this is the block time fraction. So how much of the time is in the situation of 1.8? Of course, if you choose to do a different acquisition time with your NIR, it will look a little bit different. But actually at very low RPM, almost 50% of the time, the probe is blocked. And if you speed up, it will go down to around 30% of the time. And then there will be a jump again. And this zigzag pattern is determined by RPM and of course the geometry of the spider wheel itself. And that has an effect on the effective sample size. You can see here the zigzag pattern repeats itself in the calculation of effective sample size, and here for 3 different bulk densities, all with the penetration depth of 1. But yeah, a powder blend here actually it's possible to get quite a large effective sample size with the spider wheel with the geometry we have, with 4 fingers and 3 millimeter thick fingers. Here's a comparison we did across at manufacturing scale. I try to calculate the numbers with on an aligned basis. So 1.8 second in this, where we have it's a vertical pipe where we have controlled renewal of the powder which is condensed, and we tested Bruker beam with a very large spot size. We could get a very high effective sample size in 1.8 second. We have another design where we have very low restriction flow, but we could actually also get very high effective sample size. The spider wheel on the same time scale, 126. And then if we go to the vertical situation again with controlled renewal with the small spot size, it was in 1.8 seconds, 38 milligrams. But in contrast to our Teso spoon, which we also use, there's a huge upside going from the Teso spoon to the spider wheel, because the way we operate it right now gives us a quite low effective sample size of 9 milligram per gram, and that gives us a fairly high analytical variance in our results. It's very close to a static sample. But working with sampling devices, working with different probe geometries and different ways to operate, for example, the spider wheel really gives you a lot of control in the effective sample size. And we have models for all of this, so we can put in different factors for manufacturing scale and acquisition times, different probes and penetration depth. I would say we make one real experiment with static samples where we take different amount of static samples and put on a probe, and then we find out what is the real penetration depth for a static sample, and we validate our static sample model. And then we will use that as an anchor, and then have the mechanistic models for when you have a moving sample. And then I believe we can defend effective sample size for different types of inline setups for FDA and EMA. So what such a model is, and certainly what is not, I would call it a mechanistic engineering proxy, because there's a lot of assumptions here. I also made it maybe a little bit too simplistic for some people. If they go into the literature, you could find that the optical interaction is maybe not a cylinder, it's something that looks a little bit different, and then you can multiply with a geometry factor if you want to. But it's really good for supporting how we compare the sampling devices and find the operational settings. And also we can use it to make experiments we can verify, and Andreas will come back to some results with different RPMs, for example. And I believe if we do it where we have an anchor with a static sample with some experimental data and all folded out with the models, we can answer all the questions FDA and EMA would ask about effective sample size. So it's not proven independent sample of refresh event. And as I alluded to, when you have the angular width interval where you add the two intervals, you make a rough assumption. As soon as the finger touches the edge of the probe, you say it's blocked. And you can imagine as the finger is sweeping across the probe, then there will be a sample that is contributing to the final spectrum. But you could work with that part of the model to make it more like a more advanced model than the simple sum of these two angular widths. I also assume we have no recirculation. All the material that is put in front of the probe will never see the probe again. as alluded to, binary blocking, also a simple cylinder model for the static sample, not considering optical weighing or transfer in all directions. But the experimental calibration, I would say, if you do an experiment that verifies your penetration depth, I think you can claim you have some experimental calibration of your model. And then before I hand over to Andreas, just some words on the variance model. Maybe you remember from my first slide that the variance was inverse correlated to the effective sample size. It's more complicated than this, because you will be limited. Of course, if you have the perfect sampling, then your variance will end up being only residual variance from whatever your instrument can perform, some model errors, or maybe some other non-sampling effects. I call that the flaw here. And then you add term is 1 over S, but if you look in the sampling theory from Piaget and Kim Espersen, for example, it's more complicated than this. They work with something they call a scale factor. So it's a factor that characterizes what is your particulate heterogeneity. Specifically, if you have very small effective sample size, then this factor becomes very dominant for your final variance result. And then a term called B, or factor B, and it's describes how efficiently, how independent are your subsamples in your effective sample size estimate. And here are some simulations. In the base case, you always assume B is 1, and then you will have the variance going down as the effective sample size increases and until it reaches this plateau, which is the floor. So with that, I will stop the theoretical discussions around effective sample size for a spider wheel, and also a little bit about this variance model, and